Before we get started, a little about Lake Champlain Maritime Museum. This image you see here is our 3-acre waterfront campus located just outside of Virgins, Vermont, on the western side of the state. We are a museum dedicated to inspiring people to make personal connections to Lake Champlain through opportunities to connect with our region's history, ecology, and archaeology. We really believe that when people see themselves in our past, they make stronger commitments to building a healthy future for all of us and for the lake and for our communities. The museum opened in 1985, and today we welcome about 10,000 students and visitors to experience our exhibits, our boat building and rowing programs, and our educational outreach. Chris's team also conducts new archaeological research and stewards our collection of objects, research materials, and archives. The COVID-19 pandemic and the national reckoning on racial justice have given us a chance to really assess what is important to us and what we want to achieve in partnership with our community. And to us, it's all about increasing access. The lake and its history that lies within it belong to all the people of Vermont and New York. And we want to make it possible for everyone to experience that for themselves with no barriers to that access. So at the museum, we no longer charge admission. It's free, and all of our camps and overnight expedition trips are on a pay-what-you-can model. And we're also taking steps to make our campus and our programs more physically accessible and working to make the lake and the lake's underwater cultural heritage more accessible to everyone. Our museum is open this season through October 17th, so there's still time to visit. You can make your way over this weekend and next. And if you can't make it in person, we hope you can join us online as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris, who is going to give an overview of some of the shipwrecks of the lake and what's out there and what we are studying.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, and I always like to start when we talk about the shipwrecks of Lake Champlain to talk about why there are so many shipwrecks in Lake Champlain. As Susan mentioned, we have between 200 and 300 shipwrecks in Lake Champlain, and they cover pretty much all eras of the lake's history, which you can see from this slide that we typically break down into 4 major periods. By far the longest of these 4 periods is the Native American period of the lake's history. Native American populations first moved into the Champlain Valley as the ice sheet retreated at the end of the last ice age, at least 12,000 years ago. So we have an enormously long period of Native American habitation of the Champlain Valley. This was followed pretty rapidly by the military period of the lake's history, which happened to arrive pretty much with the arrival of European explorers and settlers in the area, as they came to attempt to dominate this natural water highway that extended through the wilderness that they found in North America as they began to explore it. If we look to the map on the left here, we can see that Lake Champlain, in conjunction with the Hudson River to the south and the Richelieu River to the north, creates an almost all water route from the St. Lawrence River all the way down to New York Harbor. And it was the control of this highway through the wilderness that made it such an important piece of real estate to dominate, and hence began the military period of the lake's history. Military period of the lake's history included the earlier colonial wars, the French and Indian War, the Revolutionary War, and finally wrapped up at the conclusion of the War of 1812 in 1814. And transitioned pretty quickly into the commercial period of the lake's history. This period really saw European settlers in the area began to heavily exploit the natural resources and extract those natural resources from the Champlain Valley and send them either north to the markets along the St. Lawrence River in Montreal and Quebec, or southward to the headwaters of the Hudson River and ultimately down to New York City. From either of those locations, manufactured goods would flow back into the Champlain Valley. The commercial period really burgeoned with the opening of the canal system. In 1823, a canal was constructed from the southern end of Lake Champlain to the headwaters of the Hudson River, which allowed for an all-water transit of these materials, mostly natural resources again, and agricultural goods, from Lake Champlain to New York Harbor. This was a very dramatic opportunity for merchants at the time. What had once cost $10 a ton to carry something from, say, Burlington to Whitehall, where it would have to be transferred onto wagons, out of a boat and onto wagons, carried about 35, 40 miles to the headwaters of the Hudson, transferred back onto another vessel and taken down to New York Harbor. With the ability to load that up in Burlington and take that same boat all the way to New York Harbor, that price dropped from $10 to $1 a ton. So this encouraged a massive expansion in the commercial trade along this water corridor. Commercial period was further expanded with the opening of the Chamblee Canal, a smaller canal around the rapids in the Richelieu River to the north. And now it was possible, and that was completed in the 1840s. And now it was possible to take a vessel from the St. Lawrence all the way to New York Harbor without ever having to transship your materials into wagons. Commercial period of the lake's history really extended well into the early 20th century, though started to drop off pretty rapidly with the wider expansion of railroads in the area, as well as the highway system, which really brought the merchant carrying trade on Lake Champlain to an end in the mid 20th century. And at that point, we transitioned into what's known as the recreational period of the lake's history, in which we reside today. It's using the lake for canoeing, kayaking, fishing, sailing, ice skating, all those things that we love about Lake Champlain. Though I would like to suggest that we might be moving into a fifth period of the lake's history, and that would be a period of stewardship. Stewardship not only of the lake's natural resources, but also its cultural resources. And I guess that's hopefully what we're going to kind of continue to talk about today. So let's look at our next slide, and we can talk about some of the types of shipwrecks that came out of each of these periods. Certainly, as I mentioned, the Native American occupation of the lake is by far its longest, but I'm saddened to say that we have the least amount of submerged cultural resources or shipwrecks from the Native American period. It's quite likely that they're there, but they're extremely hard to find. And what we have here pictured in the upper left is actually a dugout canoe from Shelburne Pond. This isn't even from Lake Champlain, because I'm not aware of a single dugout or birch bark canoe that has been found in the lake itself. A number of these vessels have been found in some of the smaller bodies of water throughout the Champlain Valley. But finding one in Lake Champlain is something that has yet to happen. We also have the curious possibility of finding, more typical Native American habitation sites in Lake Champlain, as in the time since the last ice age, when Native American populations first moved into this area, the lake level was actually about 30 feet lower than it is now. So any of those habitation or campsites that happen to be along the lake's edge are now, 20 to 30 feet underwater. But once again, finding these sites is very challenging. The technologies that we typically use to find shipwrecks in Lake Champlain are really two different types. We use a magnetometer, which is just a towed device that detects large chunks of metal. It's basically a towed metal detector. And those types of materials are not found on Native American sites typically. The other would be a side scan sonar, which is taking an acoustic image of the bottom of the lake and really only detects features that stand proud of the lake bottom, like the shipwreck, the structure of a shipwreck. And again, that is not typical of Native American habitation sites. So this is a little outside of my realm of expertise, but I'm hoping that as we move forward and continue to collaborate with other researchers and archaeologists, that this is an aspect of the lake's history that we can delve into a little bit more. Now, on the upper right here, we have an image of the sinking of the gunboat Philadelphia during the military period of the lake's history. As I mentioned, there is a very extensive military history on Lake Champlain, and this led to a number of ships finding their way to the bottom, both in the form of casualties of battle, like the Philadelphia here, which sank in October of 1776 at the Battle of Valcour Island. Though surprisingly, that's actually a relatively small number of vessels that were sunk due to enemy action. The majority of the military vessels that we have in Lake Champlain were ones that were later were laid up in ordinary, or what we might call mothballed today, and were allowed to sink or rot at their berths and came to rest on the bottom of the lake in that manner. The commercial period, represented by both the pictures at the bottom of the slide, has produced by far the most shipwrecks in Lake Champlain. On the left here, we have a three-dimensional model of the sailing canal schooner, the General Butler, which is sunk just outside of Burlington Harbor, and in fact sank because it crashed into the breakwater that protects Burlington Harbor from potentially nasty weather. And this represents probably the most common shipwreck type we have in Lake Champlain, which is canal boats, both sailing and traditional canal boats, which would be an unpowered vessel, unlike the General Butler here, which actually had the capability of sailing. On the bottom right is a historic image of the wreck of the Champlain II, one of the many steamboats that operated on Lake Champlain. And here you can see the Champlain II has had a bad day. In 1775, it ran up onto a rock point on the western shore of New York, actually just across the lake from Lake Champlain and north of Westport, New York. And Lake Champlain was a very early adopter of steam technology. In fact, there was a steamboat on Lake Champlain as early as 1809. So even before the War of 1812, steam technology had found its way to Lake Champlain from its birthplace down on the Hudson River. And quite a number of those boats have made it to the bottom of Lake Champlain and are there to still be explored today, including the remains of the Champlain II. But these are not, by no means are these the only vessel types on the bottom of the lake. We have more traditional sailing craft, merchantmen, that are certainly represented on the bottom of the lake. Smaller pleasure sailing craft and rowing craft are certainly to be found on the bottom of the lake, as well as even a horse-powered ferry boat, which is again also sunk in Burlington Harbor. This was a response to the poor man's response to steam technology, which was extremely expensive and complicated to keep operational, in which a team of horses actually walked on a turntable that then transferred that power out to paddle wheels on a vessel that propelled it. So it was a horse-powered ferry boat. So, as I mentioned, about between 200 and 300 shipwrecks in Lake Champlain, representing all of these eras and many different styles, classes, and they're to be found in all manner of depths and conditions, right? We have shipwrecks in over 300 feet of water in Lake Champlain, and we have shipwrecks that are in 3 feet of water in Lake Champlain. So there's, as shipwrecks as environment, they fill many different environmental niches in the Champlain environment and in the watershed as a whole. And I'll pass it right back to Susan to carry on from here.
Great, thanks, Chris. So Lake Champlain is about 120 miles long and located between 2 states and 2 countries. And not only is the lake itself central and fascinating in all the ways Chris just talked about, and the other ways that make our jobs kind of endlessly interesting, but it's also part of a much larger basin shown here on the map. So the blue in the middle is the lake itself, and then the green area surrounding it is what's called the Lake Champlain Basin. And the basin is 8,234 square miles, which is actually 19 times larger than the surface area of the lake itself. So all of this region that you see here, all of its interconnected environment impacts what happens below the water surface. And unfortunately, climate change is no longer an abstract future topic for any of us, and certainly not for the lake and our region. Specifically here, and this is the part where I'm going to tell you what's actually already happening. So hold on to your seats. It feels can feel grim, but we're here. We're gonna talk through it. So specifically here, that means that the air temperature is rising, more precipitation is falling, and the lake is freezing less often. So according to a 2020 report from the Nature Conservancy, the mean annual air temperature increased by 2.1 degrees Fahrenheit between 1967 and 2005 in the Champlain Basin. So this region you see here. Most of those temperature increases came from increases during the winter months. The total annual precipitation during that time period was approximately 3 inches more than it had been for the entire beginning of the 20th century. So the 8 decades before that had 3 inches less rain than we have had for the past 50 years. And when the lake does freeze over in the winters, which it is doing less and less, it actually happens about 2 weeks later than it did in the early 1800s. In fact, according to modeling from the Lake Champlain Basin program, the lake freezes over about once every 4 years now. And the Basin program's researchers believe that by 2050, the lake may freeze just once per decade. And Chris will talk a little bit more about what that means in terms of the impact on the shipwrecks. So after I share these stats, I always kind of like to take a moment and say, so it's not you. You're not imagining that the lake used to freeze over, and you're not misremembering that you used to feel colder in the winter. I feel like I hear that a lot from people, and I say that too, right? Like I always remember saying, like, when I was a little kid, there was so much more snow and it felt colder. It wasn't just because my legs were shorter. It was because it was colder. You're also not making up that you need gutters on your house now in ways that you never did in the past. These changes are real and they're happening right now. So what do these warmer temperatures mean for the lake itself? So with less ice and increasing temperatures, you lengthen what's known as the growing period for the summer biological activity season, which includes the growth of invasive species and cyanobacteria blooms. So aquatic invasive species are a term you'll hear us talking about tonight, and those are defined as plants, animals, or pathogens that are introduced or make their way into an aquatic habitat where they hadn't previously been before. And not only are they new there, but they cause some kind of economic, ecological, or environmental or health harm. They compete with native species for habitat and food resources, which can alter the entire food web of the lake's environmental systems. And in 2020, there were 51 identified aquatic invasive species in Lake Champlain. So invasive species have been infesting our watershed since the early 1800s. Invasive fish species and creatures like the zebra mussel most likely arrived via those canals that Chris mentioned that were constructed in the 19th century. And invasive species are continuing to arrive through connected waterways today. The development of the interstate road systems actually brought so it's not just the canals, it's also taking your boat on the road. And the interstate road systems brought new recreational lake users to the region. And invasive species like the spiny water flea or Eurasian milfoil can hitch rides on boats and trailers that travel to the lake today. So sometimes they can come by water, they can come by road, they make their way here. Pretty crafty. And today, lake users can also unintentionally transport aquatic invasive species into the lake. So on the top right of the slide, the aggressive looking fish there is a sea lamprey, and on the bottom left is Eurasian milfoil, 2 examples of aquatic invasives. And warmer air and warmer water means that these species can keep growing and doing more harm. So you'll hear from Chris about the mussel issues, including zebra mussels, everyone's least favorite way to cut their feet, in just a couple minutes. So warmer water is also leading to increased cyanobacteria outbreaks. You may have heard of that in the news or prevented you from going to the beach this summer in both Lake Champlain and in regional lakes, smaller lakes in our region. So cyanobacteria is sometimes called blue-green algae, but it's not actually algae. They're single-celled aquatic organisms that grow in colonies. And cyanobacteria are naturally occurring in Lake Champlain. They're not an invasive species. They are here. But what happens in areas where the water is warmer than it usually is, or when there's excess nutrients, more cyanobacteria can grow, and those overgrowths create harmful blooms, as you can see here on the top right and top left. Cyanobacteria can cause cyanobacteria blooms can contain a toxin which can cause skin rashes, sore throats, digestive issues, or more serious neurological health problems to humans and animals. Harmful cyanobacteria blooms can range from small polka dots on the surface. So if you look at the lake, you can see some kind of green, tiny polka dots. They can also look kind of more like surface scum, like you see here. And they can go all the way up to kind of turquoise tinged cottage cheese that smells really bad, which I will say is disgusting to even say, more disgusting to see it and smell it. And so it's not only the toxin that is released, it's harmful to humans and pets and animals. It's also that the decomposition of cyanobacteria reduces the amount of oxygen in the water. So there isn't any oxygen available for fish, plants, invertebrates, amphibians, other aquatic species that are living underneath those cyanobacteria blooms. And that can often lead to die-offs in the water underneath a big bloom. And cyanobacteria really likes warmer water, but it also thrives in areas where there are more nutrients, which are often the conditions that happen when there is increased precipitation, including the kind of climate change impacted weather we are seeing when there's big rainstorms. And like cyanobacteria, generally nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus are naturally occurring parts of the ecosystem, but human activities are increasing the rate of nitrogen and phosphorus entering the lake, including, fertilizers on lawns, some agricultural practices, fertilizers used in ag. And those intense rainstorms that we're getting are causing even more nutrients to enter the lake. And the phosphorus loading issue is one that is getting a lot of attention is being paid to it, and a lot of work is being done in it. And there are some small improvements are being made, and the reality is that climate change is going to cause more of those intense rainstorms that are going to exacerbate the problem even more. So even as we're working to decrease nitrogen and phosphorus levels, the climate impacts of climate change are working against us. So we're kind of running on a gerbil hamster wheel here sometimes. And those exciting things that I just told you are just what we're experiencing currently. So it feels bleak to say, but what might the future look like? So according to that same Nature Conservancy report, by the end of the 21st century, we are looking at additional warming in our region, anywhere from 1 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit, and more precipitation, potentially 4 to 6 additional inches, on top of the 3 additional we've already received since the mid-70s. So that's anywhere from 7 to 9 more inches of rain than we experienced in the first half of the 20th century. The Lake Champlain Basin program is also tracking the expected arrival of several more aquatic invasive species that will have harmful impacts, like hydrilla, which is a water plant, round goby, a fish, and quagga mussels, which is one that will have particular impact on shipwrecks, and Chris will talk about more. So that was a lot of doom and gloom, but it's not all doom and gloom. And the future is not a done deal. So this, what I just said could happen in the future is not guaranteed. In 2020, the Vermont legislature passed the Global Warming Solutions Act, which created legally binding emissions reduction targets for the state, and created Vermont's Climate Council. The council is meeting as we speak and is presenting Vermont's climate action plan to the legislature by December 1st of this year. And organizations like the Lake Champlain Basin Program, Lake Champlain Sea Grant, Lake Champlain Committee, and many others are working hard and making really important changes and impact. And people are taking action in their own lives too. Every day we see amazing stories at the museum from our visitors and students we work with who tell us about the things they're doing to change the future of our environment, from buying less plastic to mowing their grass higher in their yards to replacing their floating dock systems with ones that are less environmentally impactful. So Vermonters may love to rib each other with the classic "don't like the weather, wait a few minutes" joke. We really don't have time to wait a few more minutes in this case. And these changes are here, and they're impacting our environment and our communities and our cultural resources. And I will turn it over to Chris now to show you exactly how they are doing that.
All right, well, on that note, here we go. let's talk about how these climate impacts that Susan so well laid out for us are affecting the cultural resources on the bottom of Lake Champlain, and specifically the shipwrecks. And here I've outlined them, and these are, just some of them, of course. This is a topic that seems to have endless threads that you can chase down, but we'll go through these kind of one by one and talk about how these impacts are climate driven, but also how they tend to feed on and build on other inputs into the system, like phosphorus loading and nutrient loading that are other problems that the lake is facing at the moment. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please, Susan. Right off the bat, we're going to talk about the reduced ice coverage that Susan mentioned earlier. The lake is definitely freezing less, freezing later, and then melting sooner is also my understanding. And one of the major impacts of that fact is that the lake tends to start the recreational season at a slightly lower level than it has historically, right? Less ice coverage means more opportunity for evaporation from the lake itself, and that leads to lower lake levels. And anyone that follows lake levels would certainly know that today, or this year in particular, has started off extremely low. I think that also had something to do with the fact that we had a relatively dry spring and early summer. The lake level this year barely got above 97 feet, even in the early spring, when it's often bumping up near 100 feet above sea level at the beginning of the season. And now, what impact does that have on shipwrecks? Well, first of all, the water being lower exposes shipwrecks. As I mentioned before, some of these shipwrecks are in 3 feet of water. Well, in some years, that's less than 3 feet of water. We have an example of that here on the right, where a portion of a shipwreck is exposed above water. And one thing I should certainly mention here is that the lake itself is a wonderful preservative environment. The cold, fresh water of Lake Champlain with this thick calcium-based mud that we have at the bottom of the lake preserves ships really well. Unless they're sticking out of that water, like this one. Exposed wood, and particularly wood that is wet and then dry and gets wet again and then gets dry again, that dry and wet cycling causes the deterioration of wooden shipwrecks to accelerate quite dramatically. And that's certainly something that is being affected or increased by lower lake levels in general.
So Chris was talking about I think he was talking about the lake being a really great place to be if you're a shipwreck. I like to say that if you are a shipwreck, the lake is the place you want to live, because you are you're in cold, dark water. And I think Chris is back. And he's muted, so we'll just unmute him and take him back, Chris.
The joys of virtual presentations, huh? Sorry about that. For some reason, Zoom just collapsed. I don't even know what happened. As I was saying, the reduced lake levels allow weed growth in areas where it normally wouldn't have, simply because the lake is lower. The lake level is lower. It's allowing greater sunlight penetration into areas where it normally wouldn't have occurred, and therefore weeds can grow in areas that they wouldn't have normally. And that's not a huge problem in and of itself, except that the shallow water shipwrecks are then obscured very heavily by this extra biological growth and hard to locate. Okay, let's move on to the next slide here and hope that the Zoom cooperates for a little bit longer. Let's talk about our good friends, the zebra mussels and quagga mussels. There's really not much good to say here, unfortunately, but we have had infestation of zebra mussels in Lake Champlain since the early 1990s. They spread throughout the length of the lake. They first appearing in 1993. By 1997, pretty much the entire lake, down to about 100 feet, had been colonized by zebra mussels. And these pictures here give you a good example of how they obscure shipwreck remains through the density of their growth, their colony growth. What we have here are two pictures, two similar pictures from shipwrecks. Now, these actually happen to be in the Great Lakes, but I think they're just a wonderful example of the dramatic change that we've seen in shipwreck preservation since the 1980s, which are the pictures on the top, and these pictures that are much more recent on the bottom, that are the same pictures taken from the same angle of the same image, the same structures from the same shipwrecks. And they're practically unrecognizable, particularly this one on the right, which is a cannon carriage, a cannon and cannon carriage, which when you look at the zebra mussel covered version is hard to identify what that even is. These invasive species, the mussels, both the quagga mussels and the zebra mussels, create these enormously thick colonies that coat the shipwrecks and their structures. Within that thick colony, you have a microenvironment that's created where the water within the colony doesn't exchange with the outside water column very much. And that facilitates the growth of things called sulfur-reducing bacteria that actually feed on iron. They eat the iron components that hold these shipwrecks together. And just the tremendous weight of these many thousands and millions of mussels growing on a waterlogged shipwreck can cause it to collapse as well. Now, how is this affected by climate change, right? These are invasive species. They were brought here, or at least the zebra mussel was brought into Lake Champlain a long time ago. But as I mentioned, they only live down to about 100 feet. And the reason that they stop growth beyond 100 feet is because they don't like the cold water down there and they can't reproduce as efficiently. If that water temperature continues to increase due to climate change, of course, these mussels will move into deeper water. And unfortunately, their good friends and close relatives, the quagga mussels, which is almost indistinguishable from zebra mussels, already can occupy that deep water niche. We have yet to find them in Lake Champlain, but they have been found extensively throughout the rest of North America, particularly in the Great Lakes, the St. Lawrence River, the Hudson River, and numerous river systems and lake systems in the western part of the United States as well. And they can live down to a depth of more than 400 feet already. So once they arrive in Lake Champlain, even the deep water shipwrecks are going to be at risk of being heavily colonized, as we see in these examples here. Okay, let's go on to the next slide, please. And our next slide is about our good friends, the invasive plant species in Lake Champlain, like milfoil. And this hydrilla that's on the horizon that Susan mentioned, that also grows in incredibly dense weed beds, and will choke out other native plant species. This additional biological growth that is taking place around the shallow water shipwrecks is certainly fed by the rising water temperatures, the increased light penetration, which is there is one minor benefit to the presence of zebra mussels and quagga mussels in Lake Champlain, and that is that they've actually increased the clarity of the water. Sounds good, but the reason they've clarified that is because they are filtering out all of the zooplankton and the micronutrients from the lake, which does clarify the water, but is kind of taking out that bottom rung of the food chain. That increased water clarity does allow additional sunlight penetration, which allows, again, weed growth in an area where there wouldn't normally have been weed growth. And in conjunction with increased phosphorus loading and nutrient loading from runoff, we have incredibly dense beds of aquatic invasive species like the milfoil throughout Lake Champlain in shallow water. And here we have a picture of one of my archaeological colleagues, Patricia, returning from working on a shipwreck and coming back looking like a swamp thing because we're just encountering huge amounts of these invasive plant species in Lake Champlain. So they certainly have some impact on the shipwrecks themselves. They also impact our ability to access the shipwrecks. They obscure the vessels. They make them hard to find using our traditional techniques like side scan sonar or even just visual survey. And this is also true of the cyanobacteria. The cyanobacteria itself doesn't attack the shipwreck, but it certainly makes me not want to jump in the water if it's anywhere near a shipwreck. So it's certainly restricting our access to those resources and our ability to study them in detail. All right, let's hop on to the next one. The increased rainfall, the increased intensity and frequency of storms and their associated flooding and runoff are having a number of impacts. And one of them is increased siltation throughout certain parts of the lake, right? A lot of these major flooding events are bringing huge amounts of sediment into the lake. And I have a good illustration of that here with these two pictures, which are, again, a picture from the late 1980s and one from just 2019 of a hand cart that is just adjacent to the shipwreck called the O.J. Walker, which is one of the historic preserve sites in Lake Champlain, again, located just outside of Burlington Harbor. In the image on the left from the 1980s, you can see that that hand truck, that two-wheel truck, is kind of standing proud of the bottom a little bit. You can see that it's surrounded by brick and drainage tile, which is what this ship was carrying at the time that it sank. And on the picture on the right, you can see that all of those details are obscured by the extensive siltation that's happened during the last 30 years. And of course, the hand truck itself is relatively obscured by big globs of our good friends, the zebra mussels. So these things are all kind of feeding off of each other and causing unexpected and unanticipated problems like additional siltation throughout the lake. Hop on to the next slide, please, which is another example of kind of storm-driven problems from shipwrecks. And here we're going to talk about the Spitfire. The Spitfire is a Revolutionary War gunboat that sunk in very deep water in New York waters in Lake Champlain. The vessel sits on the lake bottom virtually intact. The mast is actually still standing on this vessel. The bow gun is in place. And it's just waiting there to be explored and studied. But even in deep water in Lake Champlain, it's not immune from the effects of climate change and these various climate factors that we've been discussing. And I know these two pictures on the right are a little bit difficult to make out, but I'm going to walk you through it here real quick. On the bottom right, what we're looking at is the back end of that bow gun. That's what that tube is off to the left in that frame. That's the back end of that bow gun. And if you look just in front of it there's a huge mass of weeds. Those weeds are actually milfoil. And that milfoil isn't growing there, but it was washed out of shallow water during major storm events where it kind of tends to tumble and roll into almost like big tumbleweeds. And then it falls into deep water. It gets washed out of that shallow water into deep water. And if you look very closely at the massive weeds at the back end of the gun there, you can see little white specks in there. Guess what? Those little white specks are zebra mussels. And here on the image just above that, you can see the slide that this gun actually sat on. This gun doesn't sit on a wheeled carriage like you might think of most naval guns. It sits on a slide that just allowed the gun to go fore and aft. And those zebra mussels that washed into the Spitfire from a storm event attached to these massive weeds, when the weeds rot or finally wash away, the zebra mussels have relocated from that massive weeds and onto the shipwreck. Even though we're in water depths here that are well beyond the normal range for zebra mussel reproduction and colonization, they've basically been brought there by this massive weeds that was brought there by storm action and deposited onto the shipwreck. And now they're there. They're not going away anytime soon. So again, a rather unexpected avenue of climate impact on shipwrecks, but an example of how those impacts can even occur to what we think of as perhaps the more protected shipwrecks, the very deep water shipwrecks in Lake Champlain. Okay, so what can we do about it? But what are the opportunities here? We've talked about plenty of problems now. And I would like to promote the idea that shipwrecks are environment, right? These shipwrecks are a part of the lake environment, and therefore they make superb research nodes. A shipwreck is, I think the impacts, the climate change impacts can be studied at shipwrecks for all the reasons that we just discussed. And also the fact that shipwrecks tend to be biological concentrators on the lake bottom. Structures like shipwrecks definitely make excellent fish habitat, and we see extensive fish colonization around shipwrecks on a regular basis. Also invertebrates and other, smaller crayfish and other organisms that live in the lake tend to live around these structures. We even find freshwater sponges living on shipwrecks. And therefore, it's a place where we can study many facets of the lake's environment in a relatively contained area. The other great resource that Lake Champlain has for facilitating the examination of these climate changes, specifically around shipwrecks, is the amazing dive community that exists around Lake Champlain. Lake Champlain has a very active, a fairly large, and a very stewardship-minded dive community. These folks are much more active divers than I am. As much as I would like to be diving all the time, I don't always have the opportunity to, but there's regular dive charters from various locations around the lake that are visiting shipwrecks multiple times a week. And that provides a ready-made baseline for citizen science that I think is underutilized in Lake Champlain and holds tremendous potential for facilitating studies and supplying the data for studies by actual climate scientists. And it's something that I would really like to promote as a collaborative effort between data collectors like myself. There's one thing that the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum dive team is really good at. It's collecting data underwater in a variety of forms. We're also really good at teaching other people how to do that. And so if we can collaborate with climate scientists and ecologists around the Champlain Valley to help design projects around these research nodes that shipwrecks are, and collect data that will be valuable for those climate scientists and their research, then I think that's a win-win for everyone and further facilitates the stewardship mindset within the community, both for the lake, its natural resources, as well as its cultural resources. And with that, I'll pass things back to Susan.
So when we talk about climate change and history, often historians are documenting or discussing the history of climate change. So how either has the climate been changing? How have people's efforts to stop climate change? All super interesting stuff. But what I'd like us to think about tonight is actually a bigger question about our identity. When we lose access to the material culture of our past because it is destroyed by climate change, what else is lost? And some of what we lose is physical access. Chris talked a lot about not being able to access shipwrecks physically because of the water conditions itself. And Lake Champlain Maritime Museum manages the Vermont Underwater Historic Preserves Network on behalf of the state of Vermont, which are publicly open and freely accessible underwater cultural resources, which is, if you've probably caught on by now, underwater cultural resources is the fancy word for shipwrecks. So we manage that on behalf of the public. And we're extremely lucky to have these resources available. They belong to the people of New York and Vermont. But when you can't get in the water because of a cyanobacteria outbreak or increased runoff after a rainstorm, you lose access to them in a physical sense. Some of what we lose is also information and data. Chris does a great job of explaining a shipwreck as crime scene, that your job as a historian is to go to the crime scene, assess the data that's in front of you, put that data together to tell a story, sometimes from just the few parts and pieces that are there. We don't know what we don't know about these things. And when our evidence disappears, we can't learn from it. And we still have more to learn, and especially under new lenses. What we documented about shipwrecks 20 or 30 years, or even sometimes 2 years ago, was from a perspective of that time and place. How we document the past and what we choose to write down and what we choose to say about something at the time often says more about the present moment that we're living in than it does about what happened in the past. Every historian sees, reads, and documents through their own lived experience. When the objects of the past change through the impacts of climate change, it means that when new historians in the future go back to re-examine what we know about the past, they don't have those resources available to do that. History is often thought of as something that's just kind of in the past, right? It's history. But history is also a verb. We're doing history right now. Chris and his team and our researchers at the museum, we're actively documenting and creating new knowledge about this. And we look at it from new angles that often haven't been explored before. Sometimes, the perspective of women or enslaved people or workers on these stories. But if all we have to go on is for the shipwrecks of Lake Champlain is, the research notes from a person who documented it maybe 30 years ago, we can't look at that material culture with our own eyes, and history will be stuck being seen from one perspective forever. Another part of what we lose, I think, is also a sense of our place and identity. Of course, understanding and learning from the past is not about everything staying exactly the same. Preservation is not about keeping everything. If I truly wanted things to stay the same in our region as they were when the gunboat Philadelphia sank in 1776, I wouldn't be able to vote or own property. So, things don't need to stay exactly the same, but there is something about the things that make our region unique. And sometimes those things are our natural environment, thinking of skiing in Vermont, right? Maple trees, making maple syrup. And also part of that identity is the shipwrecks that are in the lake that we can see. Connecting to our past helps us feel more connected to our community in the present. We learn from the past so that we can build a stronger community for all of us right now and shape the future to be even better. But when the past becomes, not only a foreign country, but a country that doesn't exist at all, we don't have the tools we need to continue to build a more equitable and just society for all of us. So as we wrap up tonight, I'll echo on top of all the other pleas that we have shared about the importance of taking action on climate change. I did want to add one more plea and echo Chris. And I know I'm probably singing to the choir here because I feel like we've all converted you on the importance of protecting shipwrecks in a changing climate. But our plea tonight is really to consider underwater cultural resources as both a treasure to be preserved and a tool for identifying and stopping climate change. Both the community of people who are committed to shipwrecks and the shipwrecks themselves can be part of the solution. Because it's not too late. Despite of everything we said and some of the hard to hear things that we shared tonight, it's not too late. We can be doing more and we need to be doing more. And many of us are doing more, and there's more to do in order to protect our environment, our history, and our communities. So thank you all for doing that with us. And thank you all for being here tonight.
All right, so it looks like we have some great questions coming in. The first question from Jean was about one of the slides that had the anchors and the cannon. And the question was how long it took the zebra mussels to transform between those upper photos to the lower photos.
Sure. The two pictures in particular in that case were taken about 20 years apart. But that impact from the mussel growth was in a much shorter time span than that. Those shipwrecks in particular are in extremely deep water, well over 300 feet of water, so they just weren't accessed very frequently. But I tell you what, zebra mussels will, if you were to spend the night on Lake Champlain and put your anchor out in one of the nice protected harbors in Lake Champlain to sleep on your vessel for the night, it would not surprise me if when you brought your anchor up, it had some zebra mussels already attached to it. They can move around that quickly. And when it comes to actually covering the shipwrecks, certainly over the course of just a year or two, they were pretty much covered. particularly vessels in the less than 40-foot water depth range. They typically are just entirely encrusted with these things, sometimes in layers 4 or 5 inches thick. So it's a very rapid colonization, unfortunately.
Mm. Speaking of zebra mussels, hopefully the two of you can see the chat so that I don't have to pronounce the other question. That is, are zebra mussels, are we saying this one, zooids or in fact small-shelled critters?
Yeah, I think this is zebra mussels it's a bivalve. It's a small, they're not that different from the mussels that we all love to eat. They tend to be much smaller, usually less than an inch across their shell. They're also not something you want to eat because as they filter feed out of the water, they are also concentrating contaminants in the water into the flesh of the mussel itself. So things like lead and mercury and stuff you don't want to eat. And the veligers are actually basically a juvenile zebra mussel, and that is a free-swimming microscopic organism that is how they tend to spread around quickly within a lake or in a water system. And then as they grow to adulthood, they settle out and grow their shell, and then start making new veligers. So I hope that answers that question.
All right. Speaking of things that you shouldn't eat, or maybe should you, Lucy asks if there's any chance that milfoil is edible in the way that farmers grow kelp in the ocean.
So I can take this one. So I believe, and don't eat it based on what I say right now, I believe you can eat the root of milfoil. I don't believe you can eat the plant itself, but if you pull it out, I think you can. The root, I think, is edible. Again, it is depending on kind of where it's growing, concentrate. If it's, in a really polluted area, it can concentrate things you wouldn't want to be eating. I don't believe it's one of those things that you could eat it in a quantity that would solve the problem. But there are lots of really interesting things being done in eating invasive species. This is actually something I don't know how much is happening in Lake Champlain, but if anyone is interested, we would love to host an invasive species dinner at Lake Champlain Maritime Museum. I think that would be really fun. So let us know if you're a person who knows how to do this. And that is something that I've seen in other areas. It's in the Pacific Northwest, the Mid-Atlantic. There's a particular kind of invasive species called a snakehead in the Mid-Atlantic, and there's, snakehead cooking contests and all that kind of stuff. Again, it's hard to eat your way out of invasive species. But if you could, that would be great. There was another story I was reading about actually using milfoil as a fertilizer, like in your garden, of drying it, grinding it up. And then it seems like a lot of work to do to process it. But apparently that is a thing that potentially could be done too.
Yeah, I think it makes decent compost. So maybe you don't want to eat it itself so much, but you might be able to grow good vegetables from it. And there's plenty out there to harvest to turn into compost, of course. So. Great.
Okay, Alan asked, how often are new discoveries of shipwrecks made?
That's a good one. From 1996 to 2004, the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, in collaboration with Middlebury College, attempted to map the entire bottom of Lake Champlain using side scan sonar. And in that process, verified the location of more than 200 shipwrecks in Lake Champlain, with the caveat that was relatively old technology at this point. So undoubtedly there were sites that were overlooked or unrecognized with the technology at the time. And also that this side scan sonar survey was only completed in water greater than 12 feet in depth. So side scan sonar is not particularly effective in very shallow water. So that is where new shipwreck discoveries are actually most often made these days, is in, sadly, these weed-choked, cyanobacteria-filled shallow water areas of Lake Champlain. And how often? That's a good question. I seem to get at least a call or two a year about a site that I've never heard of. So it's still happening, and it's always exciting and fun when those things happen because it gives us all something new to go and explore and try to figure out. So we think we found most of them at this point, but certainly not all of them.
That's great. That's fun to know that you've got citizens calling in with new sightings. Another question specific to the wrecks is, has there been, this is from Jeff, has there been any progress toward a management plan for the Spitfire, given the environmental risks?
Yeah, so we'll just I feel like Jeff sounds like he has some familiarity with the Spitfire. Chris did mention the Spitfire is one of the boats that was sunk during the Battle of Valcour in 1776. The sister ship of the Spitfire, the Philadelphia, was taken out of the lake in the 30s and is currently on display at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, where it was mentioned I used to work. And we at the museum built a replica that was launched in the early 90s. And we have that replica at the museum now too. So our team identified and located and then identified the Spitfire as being kind of the final ship of the fleet of the Battle of Valcour that had not been found yet. And since then, for the past 20 years, we've been working on a management plan for the ship. And right now, our focus is, I think they're often the stories you hear are often about taking shipwrecks out of, finding shipwrecks and taking them out of the water are sometimes the most exciting parts of underwater archaeology. And they really are. They're really fun parts. The ways to keep them there are longer and more complicated. As Chris mentioned, being in cold, dark water, cold, dark, fresh water is the best thing. Humans have not created a better way to stabilize a shipwreck than cold, dark, fresh water. And even with the potential threats from climate change that we're talking about, even if we were to take all the shipwrecks out of Lake Champlain, we would not be able to preserve them better than even the way they are now with the threats they're under. So what the museum is focusing on right now for the Spitfire is a multi-year project that is focused on documenting the boat in situ, meaning where it is right now. So this summer, Chris and actually was working with Middlebury College to do a new side scan sonar project of the boat to check it out, make sure everything's doing okay. See it there. It was very cool to see the images. We have a great blog on our website about it. And then next year, we're working with a specialist in 3D modeling, underwater 3D modeling, who's going to work with our team to develop an underwater 3D model of the ship. So our hope is that we can document what's there through this modeling process and then share that with the public. Then in future years, we're looking towards doing an in-water excavation of the boat, which would be complicated. It's very deep. But we're excited about that opportunity. One of the really cool things about this boat particularly is that the Philadelphia was one of the first boats that were built in this fleet of boats built under the leadership of Benedict Arnold in 1776. And the Spitfire was one of the last. So we have these two boats kind of bookending this very concentrated period of innovation and boat building in our area. So when we're able to look at both of them, it'll be this just kind of once in a lifetime history nerd opportunity to see how people were making decisions differently over a really short period of time in the lead up to the Revolutionary War. I think you can tell I'm very excited about that. But the way we're going to do that is to start with an in-water excavation process, some stabilization of the boat itself, including the mast that Chris mentioned. And this is work that we are doing in partnership with the US Navy and the state of New York. So these are all of these, I think there's a question about collaboration in there too, which is a good one, but all of these projects are multi-jurisdictional is our term for them, that, especially a boat like the Spitfire is the property of the US Navy. It's in New York waters. Our museum is in Vermont. We have experts coming from around the world to work on this. So there's a lot of collaboration that it takes to do projects like this. And that's one of the things that makes it take a while to do it right, but also makes it happen right.
Great. And yeah, you just alluded to Alex's question, and I don't know if you want to say more to the beginning of his question about how can we encourage continued attention and action around this collaborative approach to complementary environmental, cultural heritage research, and what are the barriers to utilizing this approach?
I mean, I would say that it's more of us being the science people and the history people talking to each other. Archaeology is an amazing field because it's history and science together. But often in other spheres, the history people, and that's me, we're over here, and the science people are over here, and we're both a little intimidated by each other because we don't speak the same language. So having opportunities for bringing those people together is something that we're really working on and doing in collaboration. We have like on our team, we have historians and archaeologists and scientists working together on these projects. That is a unique approach, but one that we really want to model and we want to see more of. And I'm going to put words in Chris's mouth and say the best way to do it is obviously to get everyone in the water and get them all diving together.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And it's these things can't happen without collaboration. So we just, venues like this where we can talk about these things and promote these ideas are the beginnings to these kind of discussions that just need to be continued. So, I was overjoyed by the opportunity to address this issue in this venue, and it's really reignited our interest and passion in trying to push these conversations forward, because this isn't going to get any easier as time goes on. So we need to get this ball moving and provide what information and data we can that are going to help people that are making the decisions in policy and really helping to change the course that we're currently on.
Great. It looks like we have one last question from Patrick, and this is certainly a question that would affect a lot of us on the western side of the state, and that is, what is the effect on drinking water taken from the lake? And I think that's in connection with invasive species.
So that is a little out. I think we're both making that face. It's a little outside of our expertise. I do know that Great Places to the Lake Champlain Basin program is really looking into things around that topic. So I would definitely recommend going to them and checking out their research. My understanding is that immediately is more of a runoff issue, especially when runoff causes any kind of contaminant or sewage overflow or something to get into the lake, which is a drinking water source. But Lake Champlain Basin program is where I would direct people there, because that is, unless Chris knows something about drinking water.
Well, the only other thing I would add to that is that zebra mussels in particular, they love water intakes. As I mentioned, they're filter feeders. So any place where water is being constantly drawn across their faces so that they can eat whatever's in it, they love those places. So they often will occlude pipes by just layering on top of each other until they fill the pipe in completely. So all of the municipal water systems that get their drinking water from the lake have to deal with that issue on a regular basis by adding additional filtration mechanisms to the end of the intakes and constantly changing and replacing those filtration mechanisms.